The worst bruises aren't the ones people can see. They're the ones that teach you to smile while your heart quietly begs to be noticed. By the time my Friday night shift began, I had already checked my reflection 11 times. The mirror inside the employee restroom at Bellissimo Ristorante wasn't kind, but it was honest enough to tell me my concealer had almost done its job. Almost. A faint shadow lingered beneath my left cheekbone, where careful layers of makeup couldn't completely erase what had happened earlier that week. I tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind my ear, forced the corners of my mouth upward, and reminded myself that customers tipped happy waitresses, not broken ones. At 26, I had learned that survival often looked a lot like pretending everything was fine. Outside, rain traced silver lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Expensive sedans rolled to the valet stand one after another, while women stepped onto the sidewalk wearing elegant dresses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, making every glass sparkle like it belonged in a museum instead of a restaurant. I balanced my tray, inhaled slowly, and stepped into another evening of smiling at strangers who would never remember my name. My manager greeted me with the usual reminder to stay cheerful because an important private dinner had reserved the entire VIP room. Important people always expected perfection. I nodded, thanked him, and carried a bottle of sparkling water toward the back of the restaurant where the atmosphere somehow felt quieter despite the expensive conversations drifting through the room. Wolf had a different kind of silence. It never needed to prove itself. The table near the fireplace was already occupied. 4 men sat there in tailored dark suits, speaking softly enough that nobody nearby could hear a word. They weren't loud. They didn't have to be. Every server instinctively gave them extra space. Every busboy moved a little faster around them, and even the restaurant owner personally welcomed them before disappearing again. I didn't know their names, but I knew power when I saw it. Then I noticed him. He sat at the center of the table with one hand resting beside a porcelain espresso cup. Maybe 34, dark hair neatly combed back, clean-shaven, broad shoulders filling a charcoal jacket that fit like it had been made exclusively for him. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. His calm carried the kind of authority that made the entire room unconsciously adjust itself around him. Later I would learn his name was Adrian Romano. At that moment, he was simply another customer I hoped to serve without making a mistake. I approached carefully, keeping my voice steady. "Good evening. Can I bring anyone fresh coffee or dessert?" One of the men answered politely, while Adrian remained focused on the documents lying beside his plate. I began refilling water glasses one by one, careful not to interrupt their conversation. Just as I reached Adrian's place setting, another server brushed past behind me. My balance shifted for only a second. The tray tilted slightly. I caught it before anything spilled, but my sleeve slipped just enough for my makeup brush, tucked into my apron pocket, to graze my cheek. I barely noticed until Adrian slowly lifted his eyes from the table. His gaze didn't linger on my uniform or the tray in my hands. It settled quietly on the place where the concealer had rubbed away. For one long heartbeat, neither of us spoke. I instinctively turned my face toward the light, hoping the shadow would disappear again. It didn't. His expression never changed, yet something behind his blue-gray eyes became impossibly still. Not curiosity, not judgment, recognition, as if he had seen that same silent expression on someone else's face many years before. My pulse quickened. I lowered my eyes, apologized for the brief interruption, and stepped away before anyone else could notice. I told myself I was imagining things. Customers looked at waitresses every day. That was all this was. But as I disappeared through the kitchen doors, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked past my smile. I escaped into the kitchen and pretended I had forgotten a tray, but the truth was I needed 30 seconds to steady my breathing. The noise of clattering plates, sizzling pans, and shouted orders wrapped around me like a familiar shield. This was my world. Predictable. Safe. If I kept moving, nobody asked questions. If I smiled enough, nobody looked too closely. Maria glanced up from the dessert station and frowned. "Claire, your makeup." My hand flew instinctively to my cheek. The edge of my concealer had faded where the brush had brushed against my skin. I forced a laugh that sounded convincing enough. I must have rubbed it off. She reached into her apron and handed me a compact mirror without another word. Friends like Maria understood the difference between someone who wanted help and someone who simply wanted one more day to get through. I thanked her quietly and hurried back into the employee restroom. Under the bright fluorescent lights, the bruise looked darker than I remembered. I dabbed fresh concealer across the fading discoloration with careful movements I had perfected over the past several months. Blend. Check. Blend again. By the time I finished, the woman staring back at me looked almost normal. Almost. I took one slow breath before returning to the dining room. The dinner service had reached its busiest hour. Wine glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers while soft piano music floated through conversations about business deals, vacation homes, and investment portfolios. I moved from table to table, memorizing orders and thanking guests with the same practiced smile. For nearly 40 minutes, I managed to avoid the private room entirely. Then the owner himself stopped beside me. "Claire, Mr. Romano requested fresh espresso." My stomach tightened for reasons I could not explain. Customers requested coffee every night. There was nothing unusual about that. Yet I could still remember the way those blue-gray eyes had quietly settled on my face. I carried the silver tray toward the private room once more, determined to finish the delivery and leave before my imagination created another story that did not exist. The conversation inside had nearly ended. One man stood gathering documents while another buttoned his suit jacket. Adrian Romano remained seated, studying the rain beyond the tall windows as if the city itself had become lost in thought. I placed the espresso cup gently beside him. "Fresh coffee, sir." He looked up immediately, not at the cup, at me. There was no impatience in his expression, no arrogance, none of the detached confidence wealthy men often carried. Instead, there was an uncomfortable kind of attention, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm enough to almost disappear beneath the music drifting through the restaurant. "Who did that to your face?" My fingers tightened around the empty tray. The room suddenly felt smaller. Nobody had ever asked so directly. Most people politely ignored what they noticed. Others pretended not to notice at all. I lowered my eyes and answered with the first lie that came to mind. "I slipped while carrying groceries." Silence followed. Not the awkward silence of disbelief, but something heavier. He simply watched me for another heartbeat before giving a single slow nod. "I see." Nothing more. No lecture. No sympathy. No offer of help. Just those two quiet words. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost smiled. I thanked him, turned, and walked toward the door before my composure disappeared. Behind me, no chair scraped the floor. No footsteps followed. He did not try to stop me. He did not repeat the question. Yet somehow his silence unsettled me more than any conversation could have. As I disappeared into the hallway, I glanced back only once. Adrian Romano had not touched the espresso. He was still looking toward the doorway where I had vanished, his expression unreadable, while the rain continued falling beyond the glass, and the city lights shimmered like distant stars waiting for something neither of us could yet understand. I finished the rest of my shift on instinct alone. My hands remembered every table number, every dinner special, every polite smile, but my mind never truly left the quiet question Adrian Romano had asked. "Who did that to your face?" For simple words. No accusation. No pity. Just the kind of calm curiosity that somehow reached places I had spent months trying to lock away. By the time the last guest drifted into the rainy Chicago night, my feet ached inside my black work shoes, and the restaurant had settled into the familiar rhythm of closing. Chairs were lifted onto tables, silverware disappeared into polishing bins, and the kitchen slowly surrendered its heat. I tied another trash bag, wished Maria good night, and stepped outside beneath the narrow awning near the employee entrance. The rain had softened into a cold mist that floated beneath the streetlights. I pulled my jacket tighter and waited for the city bus that always arrived 5 minutes late. Across the street, headlights reflected against wet pavement, stretching into ribbons of white and gold. A black sedan sat quietly along the curb with its engine running. Expensive, immaculate, completely out of place beside the aging delivery trucks parked nearby. I barely noticed it. Wealthy people had drivers. That was not my world. The bus arrived, hissing as its doors folded open. I climbed aboard, found my usual seat beside the window, and watched downtown disappear behind streaks of rain. My apartment sat nearly 40 minutes away on the north side, where rent was affordable because everything else required compromise. The building was old enough to groan every winter. The elevators worked only when they felt generous, and the hallway lights flickered often enough that nobody bothered reporting them anymore. Yet it was home. At least it was supposed to feel that way. I unlocked my apartment door just before midnight and exhaled as silence greeted me. A tiny living room. A worn couch from a thrift store. Two overflowing bookshelves filled with used novels and nursing textbooks I still refused to throw away. I made chamomile tea, changed into an oversized sweatshirt, and carefully washed the remaining makeup from my face. The bruise looked lighter than yesterday, but not light enough. I reached toward the bathroom cabinet for another tube of concealer before stopping halfway. There was no reason to wear makeup at midnight. Still, I stared at the tube for several seconds before closing the cabinet again. Meanwhile, across the city, Adrian Romano stepped into the back seat of the same black sedan that had remained outside Bellissimo long after dinner had ended. His driver pulled away from the curb without unnecessary conversation. Adrian looked once through the rain-speckled window toward the restaurant before speaking quietly. "Find out who she is." The man behind the wheel nodded once. "Only what is necessary." Adrian answered without hesitation. "Everything that keeps her awake at night." No anger entered his voice. No threat. Just quiet certainty. Before the sedan reached the next intersection, two brief phone calls had already begun moving through Chicago. One reached the restaurant owner. Another reached a retired police detective who now worked private investigations. Neither caller asked for gossip. They asked for facts. A waitress named Claire Bennett. Address. Emergency contacts. Employment history. Anything unusual. By the time I finally curled beneath my blanket with a paperback resting unopened across my chest, I believed the evening had ended. I believed tomorrow would look exactly like every other Saturday. I had no idea that somewhere beyond my tiny apartment walls, strangers were quietly assembling pieces of my life like a puzzle. Not because I had asked for help. Not because anyone expected gratitude. Simply because one man had looked into my eyes, heard a lie he recognized immediately, and decided that silence deserved to be understood before it was judged. Saturday mornings usually belonged to ordinary people. Parents hurried toward soccer games with paper cups of coffee. Dog walkers smiled at neighbors they had known for years. Grocery carts rattled across cracked sidewalks while the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery on the corner. I tried to lose myself in those familiar routines because ordinary days reminded me that life could still feel normal if I stopped looking over my shoulder long enough. I finished my shift at the neighborhood bookstore just after noon and stepped outside carrying a small bag filled with discounted paperbacks I could not resist buying. The autumn air felt cooler than the night before, and the gray clouds had finally begun to break apart, allowing thin strips of sunlight to fall across the streets. My phone buzzed. The screen displayed a name I had deleted months ago but still recognized immediately. Ethan Brooks. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That surprised me. Fear had a way of becoming exhausting after enough time. I stared at the message without opening it. A second notification appeared only seconds later. Then another. I slipped the phone into my purse without reading any of them and continued walking toward the nearby bus stop. Maybe ignoring the messages would finally convince him that silence meant goodbye. It had not worked before, but hope does not always listen to experience. 2 blocks away, inside a quiet office overlooking the Chicago River, Adrian Romano stood beside the windows while one of his most trusted associates placed a slim folder on the desk. Adrian opened it without speaking. The first page contained only a photograph of me leaving Bellissimo in my waitress uniform. The next pages described the life I had spent years trying to keep ordinary. Claire Bennett, 26 years old. Waitress 3 nights a week. Part-time bookstore employee on weekends. Nursing program postponed after financial hardship. No criminal history. No outstanding debt. Lives alone. Adrian turned another page. There it was. A brief report documenting repeated unwanted contact from Ethan Brooks after the relationship had ended several months earlier. Numerous phone calls. Frequent uninvited appearances near both workplaces. No restraining order filed. No police complaint pursued. Adrian remained silent long enough that the room itself seemed unwilling to interrupt him. Finally, he asked one quiet question. Does she know how closely he still follows her? His associate shook his head. Based on everything we found, she believes ignoring him will eventually solve the problem. Adrian closed the folder carefully. And him? The answer came without hesitation. He believes she will eventually change her mind. Adrian's eyes drifted toward the skyline beyond the glass. People who refuse to hear the word no often mistake patience for permission. His associate waited for another instruction. Instead, Adrian reached for his coat. Arrange a meeting. With Miss Bennett. No. Adrian fastened one button on his jacket. With Mr. Brooks. There was no anger in his voice. Only the calm certainty of someone preparing to settle a misunderstanding before it became something worse. Across town, completely unaware of that decision, I finally boarded my bus home. The messages remained unopened inside my purse. I watched families climbing into cars, children laughing through open park gates, couples carrying grocery bags together, and I wondered what it felt like to move through life without measuring every unfamiliar face. When the bus stopped at my apartment complex, I stepped onto the sidewalk and paused. Across the street, a man leaned casually beside a silver pickup truck. Baseball cap, dark jacket, hands in his pockets. From that distance, I could not see his face clearly, but something about the way he stood made my stomach tighten. Before I could decide whether I recognized him, another city bus rolled between us. When it pulled away only seconds later, the sidewalk was empty. I told myself I had imagined the entire thing. Yet as I climbed the stairs toward my apartment, I could not shake the strange feeling that invisible decisions had already been made. And somewhere in Chicago, two men who had never met were quietly moving toward the same conversation. The city looked peaceful after sunset, but I had learned long ago that appearances rarely told the whole story. I spent the evening folding laundry, answering emails from the nursing program I still hoped to return to someday, and convincing myself that ignoring Ethan's messages had been the right decision. My phone remained face down on the kitchen counter, vibrating every so often before finally falling silent. I wanted to believe silence meant he had finally given up. Hope can be wonderfully stubborn. Across Chicago, inside a quiet private lounge above an Italian cafe that had already closed for the night, Adrian Romano sat alone at a polished oak table. A single cup of black coffee rested untouched beside him. The room carried the comforting scent of cedar and leather, and soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers. The door opened. Ethan Brooks stepped inside wearing the confident smile of someone who believed he had been invited because of opportunity rather than consequence. He looked around the elegant room with open curiosity before extending his hand. Adrian did not take it. Instead, he motioned toward the empty chair across the table. "Please sit." Ethan shrugged and lowered himself into the chair. "Your people said you wanted to discuss business." Adrian folded his hands together. "No, I wanted to discuss Claire Bennett." The smile faded almost immediately. Ethan leaned back and forced a laugh. "She is my girlfriend." Adrian answered with the same calm voice he had used inside the restaurant. "No, she is a woman who has chosen to move on with her life." Ethan's expression hardened. "You do not know our relationship." Adrian held his gaze without raising his voice. "I know enough to understand that respect cannot exist without choice." The room fell silent. No threats were spoken. No anger filled the air. Only the quiet certainty of two very different men measuring each other across a table. After several long seconds, Adrian reached into his jacket and placed a simple business card on the polished wood. There was no company logo, only a phone number. "This is the only conversation we are going to have. You are going to stop calling her. You are going to stop appearing near her home and her workplaces. You are going to allow her the future she has already chosen." Ethan stared at the card before looking back up. "And if I decide not to?" Adrian did not blink. "Then you will spend the rest of your life discovering that every door you expected to open has quietly remained closed. Every opportunity you hoped for will somehow belong to someone else. You will never know why. You will simply know that your choices led you there." Ethan laughed again, but this time the sound carried far less confidence. He slipped the card into his pocket and stood. "You are making a mistake over someone you barely know." Adrian remained seated. "Perhaps, but I have never regretted protecting someone who was trying to protect her own peace." Ethan left without another word. The heavy door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed through the empty room. Adrian finally lifted the untouched coffee, took a slow sip, and looked out across the lights of Chicago. Meanwhile, I slept through the night without hearing my phone once. When Sunday morning arrived, I stretched, made breakfast, and reached for my purse before noticing something unusual. There were no missed calls, no new messages, no voicemail notifications. Hours passed, then the entire afternoon. The silence continued. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, it felt impossible. For the first time in months, the world around me had become so unexpectedly quiet that I found myself standing beside my apartment window, staring at the empty street below, wondering why the absence of fear could feel almost as unfamiliar as fear itself. Monday arrived carrying the kind of ordinary routine I had spent months wishing for. The alarm sounded at 6:30, coffee filled my tiny apartment with its familiar warmth, and sunlight slipped through the aging blinds in thin golden lines. Nothing extraordinary happened. That was exactly what made the morning feel so strange. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop without checking over my shoulder every few steps. Nobody called my name. Nobody appeared unexpectedly across the street. Even the knot that usually lived beneath my ribs seemed a little quieter. At Bellissimo Ristorante, Maria greeted me with a surprised smile before handing me my apron. "You look different today." I laughed softly. "Different how?" She studied my face for a moment before answering. "Lighter, like you finally slept." I almost told her she was imagining things, but then I realized I had slept through the entire night without waking once. For the first time in months, my dreams had not been interrupted by the sound of a vibrating phone or the fear that someone might be waiting outside. During the lunch rush, another small surprise appeared. The restaurant owner pulled me aside near the office and handed me a sealed envelope. "Someone paid for the nursing scholarship fundraiser this year," he said. "They specifically requested that your application fee be covered if you decide to return." I stared at him in confusion. "Who?" He shrugged. "Anonymous." I thanked him, but the question stayed with me long after I slipped the envelope into my locker. Anonymous kindness sounded beautiful in movies. In real life, it usually came with an explanation. I simply could not find one. Later that afternoon, I left work carrying a bag of leftover bread the kitchen staff always shared with employees. The streets bustled with people rushing between offices, cafes, and train stations. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet something invisible had changed. As I waited for the crosswalk signal, I noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry 2 heavy grocery bags. Before I could step forward, a man in a dark jacket calmly crossed the street and offered to help her. He carried the bags all the way to her apartment entrance before quietly walking away without waiting for thanks. There was something oddly familiar about him, though I could not explain why. He was simply another stranger disappearing into the crowd. Across the city, Adrian Romano stood inside his office overlooking the Chicago skyline, while another report rested unopened on his desk. His associate entered without hurry. "Mr. Brooks has stopped contacting Miss Bennett completely." Adrian nodded once. "Good. We are also continuing to monitor the area around her apartment. Nothing unusual to report." Adrian looked toward the window instead of the report. "She does not need to know." His associate understood immediately. "Of course." Adrian remained silent for another moment before speaking again. Protection loses its meaning if it demands recognition. The office fell quiet once more. No celebration. No satisfaction. Only the steady rhythm of rain beginning to tap softly against the glass. That evening, after finishing another shift, I stepped outside Bellissimo expecting the familiar walk toward the bus stop. Instead, the valet attendant hurried after me holding a folded umbrella. "Miss Bennett," he called. "A customer asked me to give you this." I looked around instinctively. "Which customer?" He smiled apologetically. He had already left. I unfolded the umbrella and found no note, no initials, no business card. Only a simple black umbrella sturdy enough to survive any Chicago storm. As the first raindrops began falling from the darkening sky, I opened it and continued walking home beneath its quiet shelter, never realizing that a black sedan waited 1 block away until I safely disappeared around the corner before silently driving into the night. I had spent so much of my life waiting for something to go wrong that I almost did not know how to trust the quiet anymore. Every peaceful morning felt borrowed. Every uneventful evening seemed too good to last. Still, day after day, the silence remained. The unanswered messages never returned. The unexpected appearances stopped. My shoulders no longer tensed every time I unlocked my apartment door. Little by little, I caught myself doing things I had forgotten I loved. I stayed an extra 20 minutes inside the neighborhood bookstore after my shift, flipping through novels without watching the front window. I bought fresh flowers from the Saturday street market simply because they made my tiny kitchen feel brighter. I even laughed out loud when Maria told one of her terrible jokes during our dinner break, and the sound surprised me almost as much as it surprised her. "There she is," she said with a grin. I was wondering when the real Claire would come back. I smiled, but her words stayed with me long after the shift ended. Had I really disappeared without noticing? Later that week, I received another email from the nursing program. My application had been reviewed sooner than expected, and an interview had been scheduled for the following month. I read the message 3 times before believing it was real. For nearly a year, I had convinced myself that dream belonged to another version of me, someone stronger, someone unafraid. Now, for the first time, the future felt close enough to touch. That evening, Bellissimo hosted another private dinner. When I glanced toward the reservation list, one familiar name immediately caught my attention. Adrian Romano. I told myself it did not matter. He was a customer. I was a waitress. Our lives briefly crossed inside one elegant restaurant, nothing more. Yet when I carried a basket of warm bread toward the private room, my heartbeat quietly betrayed me. Adrian looked up as I entered. The bruise beneath my cheek had almost completely faded now, leaving only the faintest trace beneath my skin. His eyes found it immediately, then slowly returned to mine. There was something different in his expression this time. Relief. Small enough that most people would never have noticed, but impossible for me to miss. I placed the bread on the table. "Good evening." "Good evening, Claire." Hearing my name made me pause. I had never introduced myself. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Instead of fear, curiosity quietly settled between us. "You remembered my name?" I said softly. Adrian gave the slightest hint of a smile. People deserve to be known by their names. Such a simple sentence. Yet nobody had ever said it to me quite like that. Before I could think of a response, another guest called for fresh water, and I excused myself. As I turned to leave, something on Adrian's wrist caught my attention. An old silver watch, carefully polished despite its age. The leather strap had clearly been replaced several times, but the watch itself remained untouched, treasured rather than displayed. It looked strangely personal among the expensive suits and polished shoes surrounding him. Across the room, Adrian noticed my brief glance. Without embarrassment, he rested one hand lightly over the watch. His associate beside him smiled knowingly. "You still wear it every day?" Adrian answered without looking away from the doorway where I had disappeared. "It reminds me who I promised never to forget." His associate nodded once, saying nothing more. The conversation moved on to business, but Adrian's thoughts did not. Somewhere between contracts, meetings, and responsibilities that shaped entire neighborhoods, he found himself remembering another pair of frightened eyes from many years earlier. The same quiet smile. The same determination to convince the world that everything was fine. He had failed to protect someone once. That memory had followed him through every success money could buy. Watching Claire slowly begin to smile again did not erase the past. But for the first time in years, it made him believe that perhaps one broken story did not have to decide the ending of another. The interview invitation stayed folded inside my purse for 3 days before I finally allowed myself to believe it belonged to me. Every time I reached for my wallet, the envelope brushed against my fingertips like a quiet reminder that my future had not disappeared after all. I even caught myself smiling during the bus ride to work, watching the Chicago skyline glow beneath the early evening sun instead of staring nervously at every passing face. It felt unfamiliar to imagine tomorrow without fear. Maybe that was what healing looked like. Maybe it arrived so slowly that you only noticed it after it had already begun. Bellissimo was unusually calm that Thursday night. A light rain tapped gently against the windows, while soft piano music floated through the nearly full dining room. I was arranging fresh silverware when the owner approached me with a warm smile. "Claire, Mr. Romano has requested you for his table." My first instinct was surprise. My second was curiosity. I carried a pitcher of water toward the private dining room where Adrian sat alone this time. No associates, no folders filled with contracts. Only a simple dinner and the familiar silver watch resting beneath the cuff of his dark suit. When I placed the glass beside him, he looked up with the same calm expression that somehow never felt intimidating anymore. Congratulations, he said quietly. I blinked. For what? Your nursing interview. The words stopped me completely. My fingers tightened around the water pitcher. How did you know? Adrian held my gaze for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. Because I wanted to know whether life had finally started giving something back to you. I searched his face for sarcasm, for manipulation, for some hidden expectation. I found none. Only sincerity so steady that it made me lower my eyes. You have been helping me, I whispered. It was not really a question anymore. Adrian remained silent for a heartbeat before nodding once. Only where help could remain invisible. I looked down at the polished wooden table, suddenly remembering the anonymous scholarship payment, the umbrella, the impossible silence after months of unwanted messages. The pieces settled together so gently that they almost hurt. Why? My voice was barely louder than the rain outside. Adrian rested one hand over the old silver watch on his wrist. Because many years ago someone I loved needed the kind of protection that never arrived. His thumb brushed lightly across the worn edge of the watch. My mother believed kindness could fix every heart. She spent years hoping patience would change someone who never learned how to value it. By the time she realized hope was not enough, life had already asked too much from her. He paused, looking not at me, but at the watch itself. This belonged to her. She gave it to me on my 17th birthday and told me that real strength was measured by the people you chose to protect, not the people you could control. The room became very quiet. I felt tears gathering before I even realized I was crying. Not because of my own story, because I suddenly understood his. He had never looked at me as someone fragile. He had looked at me as someone who deserved the chance his mother never received. I am sorry, I said softly. Adrian offered the smallest smile. So am I. But regret is only useful if it teaches us to become different people. I nodded slowly, unable to find another answer. Before I returned to the dining room, I gathered enough courage to ask one final question. Do you ever expect anything in return? Adrian's expression did not change. Only one thing. I waited. He looked directly into my eyes and said, when you become the nurse I believe you will become, protect someone else who thinks they have been forgotten. I carried the empty pitcher back toward the kitchen with tears quietly drying on my cheeks, realizing that some of the strongest people I had ever met were not the ones who never carried old wounds. They were the ones who refused to let those wounds become someone else's future. I walked home that night beneath the same black umbrella, but somehow the city looked different. The sidewalks had not changed. The traffic still filled every intersection with impatient horns, and the elevated train still rumbled across the steel tracks above the streets. The difference was inside me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was not walking away from fear. I was walking toward a future. A few weeks later, I sat outside the nursing program interview room wearing the only navy blazer I owned. I kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from my sleeves while repeating the same quiet promise to myself. Just breathe. Just be honest. When the interview ended 45 minutes later, I stepped into the cool autumn air feeling lighter than I had in years. Whether I earned the opportunity or not, I had finally stopped believing that my past deserved to decide every chapter still waiting to be written. 3 days later, an email arrived just after sunrise. I had been accepted. I read the first sentence once, then twice. By the third time, the words had dissolved behind tears I no longer tried to hide. Maria hugged me so tightly at work that evening she nearly dropped an entire tray of breadsticks. The restaurant owner insisted everyone celebrate with dessert after closing. Even the kitchen staff applauded when they heard the news. It was a small celebration inside a familiar dining room, but to me it felt like the beginning of an entirely different life. As the last guest prepared to leave, I noticed Adrian Romano standing near the entrance, adjusting his coat before stepping into the chilly evening. Something inside me refused to let him disappear into another quiet memory. I hurried outside just as his driver opened the rear door of the black sedan. Mr. Romano. He turned immediately. The city lights reflected softly across the wet pavement between us. I stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure how to put gratitude into words. I got in, I said, holding up my phone with the acceptance email still glowing on the screen. A genuine smile appeared on his face, small but unmistakable. I never doubted you would. I laughed through tears that refused to stay hidden. You believed in me before I believed in myself. Adrian shook his head gently. No, Claire. I simply recognized the strength you had forgotten was already there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The traffic moved steadily behind us, while a cool breeze carried the scent of rain through the streets. Finally, I reached into my bag and removed the black umbrella he had once arranged for someone else to give me. I think this belongs to you. Adrian looked at it before quietly closing my fingers back around the handle. Keep it. I frowned slightly. Why? He glanced toward the dark clouds gathering over the skyline. Because everyone deserves something that reminds them they do not have to face every storm alone. My eyes filled once more. This time I did not look away. I will never forget what you did for me. Adrian gave a slow nod. Then promise me something instead. Anything. When life gives you the chance, become the reason someone else believes tomorrow can be better than today. I smiled. I promise. He inclined his head with quiet satisfaction before stepping into the waiting car. The sedan pulled away without hurry, disappearing into the flowing stream of downtown traffic until only the red glow of distant taillights remained. Months later, during my first clinical rotation as a nursing student, I met a frightened young woman sitting alone outside an examination room. She kept insisting she was fine, even though her eyes quietly disagreed. I sat beside her, offered a warm cup of coffee, and simply listened. No judgment, no pressure, just patience. As I watched hope slowly return to her expression, I finally understood what Adrian had given me had never been protection alone. He had restored my belief that kindness could still change the direction of a life when it arrived without asking for applause. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who rescue the world. Sometimes they are simply the ones who notice a silent heart, choose compassion over indifference, and walk away without expecting their name to be remembered.